We have a good crowd here this afternoon, so thank you so much for making the time to join us for Gary's presentation. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Zach Kamenker, and I graduated in 2016 from St. Anselm. I have the pleasure of serving as the president for the Manchester Regional Alumni Network. And today it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar of Gary's 20 Poems to Pray, a book reading, presented by Gary Bouchard of the English department. He has been with the college since 1987. He has chaired the English department, served a term as the executive vice president, worked on a variety of committees, and is an early modern scholar. He is currently the executive director of the college's Gregory J. Grappone Humanities Institute, and the college is committed to keeping our alums and friends engaged with programs like this through the arts and humanities, offering webinars, podcasts, social media events. We've been impressed, very, very much so, with the programming offered this spring and now into the summer. So feel free, if you have programming suggestions, to contact the Alumni Relations Office. Today's webinar is being recorded, so it will be posted on the college website for those of you who know anybody who couldn't make it live today. Professor Bouchard will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have some time to take questions. There is a Q&A button on the screen. If you submit your questions there, they'll come through to me, and I will moderate the discussion afterwards. So please do not submit any questions through the chat. Those would be visible to everybody. So we ask that you use the Q&A feature. So as I said, Dr. Bouchard has been active in the English department since he arrived on the Hilltop in 1987, and has specialized in 16th century writers of the early modern era, including Robert Southwell. And he has organized the college's annual Marathon Sonnet Reading Festival on Shakespeare's birthday for, I think we marked about 30 years this year, or even more than that. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Gary now, and thank you again for being here.
All right, thank you, Zach. And thank you all for taking part of this beautiful sunny day to spend a little bit of time with poetry and with me and with St. Anselm. It's very much appreciated. I do want to say at the outset that our Friday forums for the fall through the Grappone Humanities Institute, at least some of them I'm sure are going to be in a format similar to this. So if you're remote, you can join us. Really fantastic questions and presenters lined up starting as early as August 21st. So this is I'm just gonna be reading two, maybe three sections from this book here that was published by Liturgical Press last September, and has done pretty well for them. And they don't usually publish poetry. This is an unusual offering for them, and they're very surprised at just how popular it's been. I'm a little surprised too, but I'm not objective. I love poetry, and it has a place in everybody's lives, whether you're aware of it or not. So I organize these small meditations, homilies, whatever you might want to call them, centered around some well-known poems and some not so well-known poems. None of the poems I'll be treating today are well-known. And Zach, none of them are from the 16th century, so we can all be relieved at that. But I organized them, when I pulled them together into a book, it was a column that I did for 3 years for a magazine, and then I took them together and rewrote them all and organized them into the seasons. There are 6 seasons in this book. I don't know how many seasons there are in your life, but in this book, there's autumn, and then Advent, and Christmas, New Year's, Lent, penitential time, Easter, Pentecost, and then the holiest season of all, summer, which is upon us. So today I'm just going to be reading a couple poems and maybe a third one as well but I'm going to center our attention on this glorious season in which we are in, distanced and sheltered though we may be. So the first one I'm going to do is called Bicycling to Heaven. And it's about as much fun as it sounds. And I'm doing it in part because it's a beautiful summer poem. I think it's also written by Clare Nicholas White, who died last week. And she has a connection remotely to St. Anselm College because most of you are familiar with Sylvia Nicholas, who lives up here in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, and her father did the windows of the Abbey Church. She did the mosaics in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, the windows in the refectory of the monastery, and of course, her favorite piece, the statue of St. Anselm, as well as the statue of St. Benedict and the statue in a grotto. So this is Sylvia's sister, who I came to learn about through Sylvia. She's really was a remarkable woman and a beautiful person. And so I dedicate this to her and her recent passing last week. By midsummer, the heat inside many churches can make formal liturgical ritual somewhat challenging. Layers of winter clothing are shed, impending perspiration impinges upon our piety, and as in Jesus's day, many human toes protrude from sandals. On especially warm days, priests often grant their congregation the reprieve of a brief homily, which results often in the kind of succinct and profound wisdom that only brevity can beget. Ordinary time, of course, is not ordinary. It is punctuated with such great feast as Corpus Christi, and the full power and meaning of all of those other seasons and feasts settle in upon us. Still, as summer sun streams through the stained glass and inadequate rotating fans blow noisily in the back of churches, things are just a bit, well, less solemn than usual. Like our church, poetry too can often suffer from too much solemnity. Too many people feel like they are not really qualified to read it, that they must somehow approach it on their knees in the literary sanctuary of a classroom, while a teacher reverently opens up the tabernacle of its secret meanings. This is an unfortunate perception. Poetry is really the woman gossiping on her way into church, the daydreaming altar server, or the old man silently weeping in the back pew. And the more sunny and casual days of ordinary time are a perfect time for all of us to relax and just behold the next poem or prayer that passes through our cluttered, worried, and extraordinary lives. How about a poem that would have us get off of our knees and climb onto a bike? Clare Nicholas White's poem, Bicycling to Heaven, sings with the kind of light summer day optimism that we should not have to be a child in order to experience and celebrate. Clare Nicholas White is the sister of the accomplished sculptress Sylvia Nicholas, whose work in stained glass and bronze can be seen in many churches and other venues throughout the world. Both women are descended from generations of Dutch artists, and both of them immigrated to America from the Netherlands several decades ago. Clare graduated from Smith College and has succeeded as a translator, a poet, a novelist, a biographer, authoring several translations and original books. She has lived most of her life in St. James, Long Island, until her recent passing with her sculptor husband, Robert White. In the short poem I offer here from Clare's 1998 volume, News from Home, the poet suspends and invites readers to suspend the inevitable uncertainty and disappointments of our spiritual lives. To forget momentarily the thousands of missteps we have made on the rocky path of the straight and narrow road. To forgive the many trespasses we have suffered from others, and to allow God to forgive us in turn. To choose a bicycle of our favorite color and style, and happily take a ride with her to the eternal destination that we all long to reach. Bicycling to Heaven. I shall glide on the road to paradise, on silver wheels glistening between trees, as tall as virtues. I shall be light and clean, bathing in rectangular pastures, with beast anchored there, The road is straight, make no mistake, and though I have not entered the castle yet, this fortress grounded like a cow, I have been on the road, which is enough for now. When we think about the road to heaven, we are more often than not prompted by preachers and by our own experience to think of it as a rough and rocky climb, a sort of personal Calvary of our own, punctuated by inevitable stumbles and falls under the weight of our personal sins and crosses. Or we may fancy ourselves, as I often do, chatting worriedly on the road to Emmaus, walking along completely unaware that our traveling companion is Jesus. Maybe sometimes we are running excitedly down a path with Mary Magdalene to share the news of our risen Lord, only to be met by the skepticism of our fellow disciples. Still other times, we may imagine ourselves off of the road altogether, up in a tree with Zacchaeus, just hoping for a break. But have any of us ever imagined bicycling our way to the kingdom of God? Long stretches of winter in our lives, be it actual winter, or grief, or penance, or just despondency, or COVID. They beg for relief. We beg for relief from the kind of resolute joy, faith-filled assurance, and even whimsy that this poem offers. In the small prophetic vision that Clare invites us to share, we do not even need to pedal very much. She says that we will glide on the road to paradise, on silver wheels, glistening between trees as tall as virtues. We should note that the road, though it would seem to require little effort, is lined with trees that seem to represent the kind of virtues necessary to shape such a road. And the poet makes clear to any potentially puritanical readers, the road is straight, make no mistake. This is no mere pleasure cruise, but neither is the cyclist on this road someone who is worried about salvation and sin. Rather, she envisions herself as having received the full promise of God's redeeming love, and she rejoices not just in the destination to which that leads, but in the journey it affords. Quote, I shall be light and clean, bathing in rectangular green pastures, with beast anchored there. The cows or sheep anchored in the pasture are going nowhere, and God's kingdom is similarly envisioned as a castle, a fortress, and seen like childlike playfulness, grounded like a cow. It is the sort of welcoming permanence and eternal stability we all long for on our roads, though we have, quote, not entered. Still, as we glide or pedal along, it is the journey to the kingdom, the very lives we are living, rather than the arrival at our eternal destination, that is celebrated here in this poem. Quote, I have been on the road, which is enough for now. May your next bicycle ride be a prayerful one. And if your cycling days are over, or the paths around you are still buried in snow or crowded with others, or you just need relief from the sorrows and disappointments and detours of your way on your way to the kingdom, go ahead and try with Clare's help to make your next prayer a bicycle ride. And may that glide between tall trees and pastures be enough for now. So, I'll do at least one more. And this one is more personal because it's a poem written by my mentor and teacher, Sister Mary Faith Schuster, who was a Benedictine. And as I think everything you need to know about her is contained within this, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Dear World, Sister Mary Faith Schuster, 1914 to 2007. Occasionally, a student will ask me how I became interested in studying and teaching literature. Such a question arises from a brave and curious place inside a young person who is still trying to figure out the next steps into what can be a frightful and perplexing future. I respond by telling such students that I met a woman who changed my life. Then when I pick up this picture from the bookcase and hand it to them, they are surprised to find themselves looking at the picture of a nun. Can you see this? They're surprised to find themselves looking at the picture of a nun. Let's see if I can find my place, whose white hair halos the space between her face and a small black veil. A nun whose eyes, even in that fading black and white photograph, are somehow blue and piercing, wise and serene. These are the eyes I first encountered in Sister Mary Faith Schuster when I was a very green 18-year-old on an improvised college search trip from my hometown of Denver, Colorado. I had traveled with a friend to the wooded bluffs of eastern Kansas that rise above the vast and meandering Missouri River, and from which one can see for hundreds of miles. I would spend many important hours looking out at the world from those bluffs. But on that first late winter visit to Atchison, Kansas, and Benedictine College, I sat in the small, tidy office of the chair of the English department, listening to the kind of voice that went with those eyes, and receiving the first of many lessons I would learn from the woman who would become the most important teacher I have ever had. "You are so young," Sister Mary Faith told the two of us. These words are usually spoken with condescension, but from this mysterious, ageless woman with the small black veil, they resounded with admiration and wonder, as if we were something remarkable that nature had put in her pathway on one of her many walks. Many of us are far too anxious to fill our students with sage advice, but Sister Faith just wanted us to know what a gift we were. And that was her in essence. Nobody ever encountered Sister Mary Faith, even in passing, without coming away feeling somehow more special. That trip to Atchison, Kansas was somewhat unremarkable, except for that short conversation. I was still basically clueless about what a Benedictine was, but that brief encounter persuaded me that I wanted to take the next step in my life under the guidance of this woman, whom I would come to regard as close to wisdom herself as I would ever get. A person is richly blessed who can have one teacher opened up books and minds and the world with such tenderness and reverence that my ambition to be a journalist slid off me like the skin of a snake without me ever noticing. Among her many gifts, Sister Mary Faith was a prolific and remarkable poet. She didn't really write poems, rather they spilled out of her on a daily basis as part of the ongoing conversations she held with God and the world he had created. Her life itself was a poem. Raised in a large and devout German Catholic family in Pilot Grove, Missouri, she was one of 4 in her family who took vows as Benedictines. In fact, her younger sister, Sister Scholastica, taught with her in the English department at Benedictine. In her poetry, Sister Faith harkened back often to the sights and sounds of the farm in the small town where she was raised. The spider webs in the barn, the child's wonder on liturgical feast days, the strength of her father's hands, and the sacred songs in her mother's voice. But it was to Mount St. Scholastica Convent in Atchison that she came as a young student, and where, but for her years of graduate study at St. Louis University and other assignments, she lived out her vocation as a sister, a teacher, an administrator, and a poet. In 1935, she described her decision to take vows at St. Scholastica, then several hundred sisters strong, in a short poem called "When I Was 1 and 20." My desire is a world that reaches from star to star. My heart is a hungry place where great distances are. And yet my peace somehow I have come to learn, is a simple and sheltered place where some candles burn. Choosing what other poem of Sister Faith's to share with people was more challenging than I had imagined. I enlisted my wife for help, and we both kept settling on one poem and then another, each one as delightful and affirming as the next. The coyote encountered in the dark of early morning, who is, quote, very sure this Missouri field is his as mine. Simon, who when he took up Jesus's cross on the way to Calvary, teaches us that, quote, perhaps all books could be pared down to that one moment each of us got picked from the crowd for something menial. Exuberant conversations with hope, with stars, with fields and flowers, the joy in, quote, the creation's first thunderous command when, quote, the apple trees awake and rabbits stir and squirrels soar, and in the quiet cold the winter birds remember the face and everlasting arms that gave them love. I went to bed with a dozen such poems ringing in my head and awoke still undecided about which poem to lift from those bluffs by the Missouri River to readers standing in landscapes and cityscapes everywhere. I began to thumb once more through Sister Faith's book of poems until the pages opened, or maybe they were opened providentially by my old teacher, to an obvious choice I had somehow missed. What would Sister Mary Faith want to write to you? Of course, her poem from over a quarter century ago called Dear World. In deference to the gifts of my good and great teacher, I will do her the grace of simply offering you this poem without any of the explicative insights that would only smudge her words with overthinking. Sister Faith's brief epistle to the world rises from the page as a summer psalm of effusive gratitude. It is a gift from across the years and miles, from the bluffs and fields of eastern Kansas to wherever you find yourself sitting today on what I hope is a warm and eternal summer day where you can exhale these words. Dear world, almost paralyzed with summer, I watch the days go by. The katydids are interceding. Birds with castanets and harmonies are on the wind, looking with good messages of summer for people who may need them. Let us be quiet, summer, so the fields can grow. Let the day come in. Winter will hurry soon enough. Autumn will blow along in wind and dusted rain on wings of its own song. Let us watch the birds and let our needs go on to heaven through the invisible, but ever interceding intercessors from hidden glory in the bushes of the night. So, really happy to be able to share that with you. Sister Faith is very appreciative of that. I can answer questions, I can speak to you, I can read another one and another one, I can recite Shakespeare sonnets, Zach, whatever you think.
Well, I think that was a very nice reading and a touching tribute to Sister Mary Faith. So we do have some questions that have come in, and folks can feel free to continue submitting them, and I will moderate. But I have a few here, and the first one, I think a good one to start with, is how did you discover your love for poetry?
Well, I think most of the answers to that question are in that last essay I just read. I think without the encounter with that teacher and the other teachers, that love would not have happened. It certainly wouldn't have been cultivated. I think I knew a couple of things about myself growing up. One is that I was interested in language, but I wasn't from a family of readers. So I was kind of on my own where theater and books and the arts were concerned. Just wasn't the kind of family I was raised in. But I do remember counting out syllables to words of songs and other things from a very, very young age. So I was somehow measuring meter of language probably by the time I was 5 or 6, but I had no idea what that meant or why I was interested in it. And but I wasn't as smart as most of the other students around me, but I was more clever. And I always thought I would do something with one way or the other with language because I wasn't very good at anything else. I mean, and every high school science and math class I ever took confirmed that. And I did have one teacher my sophomore year in high school who was the catcher in the rye, who really rescued me before I went off the cliff. We don't want to talk about what was happening in my life academically at that moment, but somehow she saw something after she had kicked me out of class one day. And that was a huge difference. But then the encounter with Sister Faith was, must be like a lot of you have had that experience where you finally met someone who understood who you were and what your potential was. And which is the noble, very, very noble, delicate, and profound work that teachers and coaches do. Often we don't know it. We don't know it till 10 years later or never, but we notice something that nobody's ever noticed about that person. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I agree. And I think we all can definitely relate, as you said, Gary, to those teachers who influence our love of something. Language certainly resonates with me in very much the same way that it did with you. Another question that came in, can you explain how you chose which themes to put the poems in, how you chose the poems? So what was sort of the process for you in choosing these poems and the thematic element? That's a really great question as well.
Sure is, yeah. I think, had I conceived what I was doing as a book when I began doing this, I would have done it differently, and the poets and the poems probably would have been different than what we have. And so I was, I'm the consulting editor of Parable Magazine here, which is the magazine of the Diocese of Manchester that I helped co-found 14 years ago now. And the editor kept wanting me to do a column on poetry, and each year I was successful in saying no and finding a good reason why not. And after a number of years, she was unrelenting, thank goodness. And so I said, okay. And I took the phrase from Robert Frost, "the figure a poem makes." And so I had a column for 3 years called "The Prayer a Poem Can Make." And so I was choosing poems for a mostly Catholic audience. I was choosing poems for readers who knew nothing about poetry. And this task, and I was trying to choose poems that often matched the time of the year that the magazine would come out 6 times a year. And so as a result, that by the way, if you put those 3 things together, that is a much more difficult task than I had imagined. And it went fine for 1 year. Second year was harder, and then it was a popular column, so I agreed to do it for a 3rd year. And I was really running out of something that would match that peculiar audience. And then when I had 18 when I was done, and I thought I would pull them together, try to pull them together into a book. And so I had to do 2 more. I found 2 more poems. I ordered them seasonally. They seemed to work pretty well seasonally. I think I was the one who was most surprised when I sent it to Liturgical Press, and they hopped right on it and said they wanted to publish it. So that's how that came about. Like everything in life, providentially and accidentally.
Well, the process of any type of writing is always fascinating. I think the lining things up theme by theme can be very challenging. So I'm not surprised to hear that it was more challenging than you thought it was. But
Yeah, it lacks, you know, the poets are all great and the poems are great. It just lacks a certain kind of diversity. There, a lot of Catholic writers and a lot of Anglican writers, and it definitely cuts across the ages, from the Renaissance in England up through the 21st century. One Jewish author, one Quaker author, Robert Frost, a religious agnostic. So yeah, there is some range of, they're not all Catholics. There's a poem in here by the John Paul II, and a poem by Roland Williams, the former Archbishop of England, who's an extraordinary, both of whom are extraordinary poets. So, and William Shakespeare, why not?
Shakespeare makes everything better. That's what I always say. Another question that came in, which poem is your favorite of the bunch?
My favorite of the bunch is probably September, the First Day of School by Howard Nimrod. Many people who know me well know me how much I just cherish that. That's a remarkable poem. And the other one by a still living Benedictine, who is the same age as my mother would have been. She died last year. He's 98 and is at St. John's Abbey. Was a systematic theologian professor at St. John's for years, and started writing poetry when he was 75 and published 3 exceptional books of poetry. And I didn't want to read his poem today because it's Lenten. And I didn't want to bring us back to Lent, but his poem, Hogs and Salvation, about the prodigal son standing in the pigsty, is fantastic. That is also one of my very, very favorites. And I've had some wonderful encounters with Killian over the years, including 2 years ago. He's in the infirmary, but still listening to books on tape, and at least at that time was still sharp. And he told me when I parted from him, I made a point of going to visit him when I was there. And then when I parted, he's Killian's an Irishman from Montana, very funny, bright man. And he said, tell the world I'm still writing, but not to hold their breath. So I wish you could meet him. Anyway.
Great story. Thank you. We have another question, and folks can still feel free to submit them through the Q&A because we have some time here. But a great question came through. I'm curious about this as well. Where can we read more of Sister Mary Faith's poetry? Is there a place for that?
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Can you ask that again?
That's okay. Someone would like to know where they can read more of Sister Mary Faith's poetry.
Oh my goodness. Good luck is all I can say. Let me grab her book. I don't know whether you can get a copy of this or not. You probably, to get a copy of this book, I would say Amazon is not going to help you, but you could probably write to the Mount St. Scholastica Convent in Atchison, Kansas, and I'll bet you there are copies of this book. It's called Give No End to Praise. Give No End of Praise by Sister Mary Faith Schuster. It was published there in Atchison. It may be hard for you to come by, but if you're really in earnest about that question and you can't get a copy, email me and I'll track one down for you. I know the people there, Sister Thomasita, would be happy to track one down for us, so I'm sure they still exist.
Excellent. Great question came through. I know you've shared this with some of your students before, but for those who don't know, what was it that brought you to St. Anselm College, to the Hilltop in the late 1980s, from your roots at Benedictine and your roots in Denver, Colorado?
Well, I think you know, Zach, I was running from the law. I got as far east as I could go and my passport expired. I don't know why every move in my life has been east. I was born in New Mexico, and every move since then has been a move east. My father, people may not know, I have strong New England roots. My father was an Oxford man. That is, he was born in Oxford, Massachusetts in 1919. A little town near Auburn, near Rochdale, near Leicester, near Worcester. So my roots are from the heart of the Commonwealth on that side of my family. And how I ended up back, I'm the only one in my family of 6 children that end up anywhere near New England again. We were all raised in various places out west because my father, when he was done, he graduated from Holy Cross in 1940. And his reward for that was to become a turret gunner and radio guy in the front turret of a B-24 over Hong Kong 29 missions. And after he survived being shot down, etc., he requested to be stationed in Springfield, Massachusetts. So the Army Air Corps sent him to Galveston, Texas. And he went to a USO dance within the first week and fell in love with my mother. So that was the end of the New England story. Eventually they married. We were all raised out west. But I knew about this place, New England, in New England, and I knew my old friend Robert Frost pretty well. I didn't imagine that a place like New Hampshire actually really existed. I thought it was a fictional thing that Frost had invented. So yeah, how did I come back? I don't know. I was in Chicago finishing up my my graduate degree. I had run out of money. My stipend was up. And my bride-to-be and I had a very, very sophisticated line of thinking, which was, if you really want to teach college, I think there's a lot of them in New England. We should drive up there and look. I'm not making that up. I had a tweed coat that I had gotten from $5 at a thrift store, a half-baked resume, a half-written dissertation, and I cold called on colleges and universities in New England in driving around in my uncle's borrowed car. That is not a word of that is made up. And I met the chair of the English department, Professor Ilona Lucas, and went back to Chicago without any prospects. And she called a couple weeks later and asked if I would come teach for a year, freshman English. And that they had a job in Renaissance literature opening. There were no guarantees, but at least I'd be on campus. So I moved to New Hampshire in August of 1987 with a promise of $8,200 in teaching, a fiance in tow, and on a 1-year contract. And at the last minute, the legendary Father Jude was sent to California. And I got a phone call in my empty apartment in Chicago with nothing was there but a telephone from Ilona Lucas saying, we see that you also have a degree in communications. Would you be willing to teach public speaking? I had never even taken a course in public speaking. My communications work was all journalism. So I put down the phone and thought about it for 4 seconds and said, sure, I can do that. All of a sudden, I'm not making this up, Megan, $21,000 and benefits. It was like lottery. I had won the lottery. I've been winning the lottery at St. Anselm ever since. One thing led to another. Somehow I snuck into the tenure track job, and they've been trying to shake me off ever since, unsuccessfully.
Such a great story. I can picture you touring around New England, visiting local colleges.
In February, like, what the hell is a frost heave? What's a frost heave? What the?
Oh, excellent. Nice question came through about your family and your upbringing. So were you raised in a Catholic family? What did religion look like?
I was raised in a Catholic family, and religion looked like church. I really wish I had a better story to tell. But it was the devoutness of a rule-following Catholic family in the 1960s and 70s. Of the 6 siblings, I'm the youngest, which should be pretty apparent to everyone. I think there are 2 of us left that are Catholic. But yeah, that you didn't read the Bible. You just went to church, and if you didn't went to church, you went to hell. So it was that.
Well, there you go.
It was that that kind of a family. But I don't know. I wish I had more inspiring things to tell you. I'm really great people. Love my family. Very happy I met people like Sister Faith. That was important.
Nice. Are any of your personal poems in the book?
Yeah, the last one in the book is my poem about raising a toddler, called Genesis 1:1. I would have read it if we had time, but Sister Faith's more important. But yes, that's a pretty immodest thing to do, but the last chapter is one of my own.
Nice. Question came through, is there an update on an audio of your book? Someone said they heard that might be the next thing.
I've seen it advertised at Liturgical Press, the audio book version, but I've not heard it, and nor am I the one reading it. They, for whatever contractual reasons, they hired an actor like Zach Kamenker, who has a better radio voice. I'm really curious to hear it. I hope they hired somebody with a nice velvety voice, but could be Elmer Fudd for all I know. I haven't heard it.
Well, that'll be interesting to hear your poems read in a voice that you don't know.
Yeah, it really will.
Yeah. So it looks like I have a couple more questions here, which is fine because we're getting toward our wrap-up time. A gentleman said, thank you for this very thoughtful session. It sets a very calm, reflective tone for this challenging time. I agree, many of these events have done just that at a time when we need it the most. This question is two parts, so I'm going to begin with the first one. What was the one poem that just missed getting into the book that you would recommend to the audience?
The one that just missed, well, dozens of Sister Faiths. Well, that's a great question. Well, the one that just missed getting into the book was just too expensive for me to print. One of the things you have to do, at least where Liturgical Press is concerned, I think this is true of many presses, is I had to get permission for each one of the reprintings. So I have a nice correspondence with the Vatican Library for Pope John Paul II's poem, and some of the living poets. I have some in my correspondence with Clare White. I now cherish now that she's passed, and often there's a fee of $15, $25, pretty reasonable fee. T.S. Eliot's The Gift of the Magi, which is an amazing poem. I very much wanted to, I had published that in the magazine, and that was going to be part of the Christmas section. Eliot's poems are controlled by his family, and it was 600 English pounds to reprint his poems, something like that. It was outrageous, both because of the money and the principle of the thing. I just wouldn't do that. I just don't think that Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson are free, and Eliot, it's really unfortunate, quite frankly. So The Gift of the Magi is a beautiful poem, but it's not in here because I wasn't going to ante up that much. I will end, Zach, when we're done answering questions. I'll read the one poem by me. I won't do the meditation, but I'm happy to end with that poem.
Sure, there is one last question, and then we'll turn it back over to you. Are there other books that connect poetry with prayer that you would recommend?
Not really. But I think what I've done is unusual, if not unique. But there is the Poetry of Piety, which is, it's not really connected with prayer, but it is Christian analysis, more Protestant in leaning about poetry. And there's also this book here. I can't find it. can't put my hand on it. There's oh, this one here by Joseph Pierce, Poems Every Catholic Should Know. But it's, again, it's not prayer, but it's a pretty interesting collection from the ancients. It's not all Catholic poetry by any means, but it's just why every Catholic should know these. So yeah, that's, there's a couple, but connecting prayer with poetry, I think, is an unusual enterprise. Not, as I say in my introduction, not every poem is a prayer. And a lot of prayers are really bad poetry. And finding that intersection and some of the poems in this volume that I've done are prayers. They were written as prayers. Some are just prayerful. Most were not written as prayers. They're just, I just think they're prayerful. I think they can inspire prayer in us.
Sure.
And that's enough. So if there are no more questions, I'll just read the final poem. We'll be done, and you can, your lunch break is over and you have to get back to your life. I hope you have a beautiful summer day. I hope this brings some solace and some peace in yes, what is a difficult season for all of us in so many ways. So for my son, my eldest son, who will turn 30 this fall, this was written when he was a reckless toddler. Genesis 1:1. You know, Genesis 1:1 is a sentence fragment. I don't know if you knew that. The first verse of the Bible is, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. It's a subordinate clause. Isn't that fantastic? Genesis 1:1. The earth is trampled under by 2 small feet, carrying chaos on wings, sweeping from place all that order has placed, teaching objects to fall. You catch them to keep the world from breaking. Balancing treasures on top shelves, keeping them things out of reach, then handing them down a piece at a time to hold and turn and see and remember. The world, small and blue in a universe of galaxies, is yet too big to know at once. It must be rationed in blocks and buckets, spoonfuls and cattails, 1 leaf, then 2, then tree, wave, then water, then sea, word by word, and truths small enough to be so. And there is evening, and there is morning, one day. When chaos is abed and all objects steadied, we must go about replacing the small samples and pretend, since it is our house at which we play, to know where everything on earth belongs. We must try to see the world at once and hold and turn and provide. So, thank you all very much. Thank you, Zach, and thank you to Patrice and Megan for organizing this. Please stay in touch with your teachers. We miss you, and stay in touch with St. Anselm. We'll bring the hilltop back to life, 6.5 feet apart, one day at a time.
Thank you, Gary, for a great afternoon session and for sharing your poetry. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and coming on. Definitely keep posted of other webinars and events through the college emails, the Anselmian Hub on our website. And take care and enjoy the summer.
All right. Be well, everyone.